Number 7. Russian aircraft. A former military airstrip called Gorilovo is located about 14 miles south of St. Petersburg, Russia. A few aircraft still use it, and it serves as a hub for aviation maintenance. The runway's short segment is designated as a military helicopter cemetery and is the most interesting feature. To deter people looking for scrap metal, the site is gated off and watched over by guards and dogs. In 1939, the military airfield was first established. Initially built on a smaller scale, the runway was expanded during World War II to accommodate jet fighters. At this airport, the 19th Fighter Aviation Regiment guarded the nation's northwest borders and Leningrad, which is known today as St. Petersburg. According to records, the unit participated in over 3,400 missions between November 1939 and March 1940. The 11th Guards Fighter Aviation Vyborg Order of Kutuzov Air Defense Regiment and the 29th Guards Fighter Aviation Volkov Regiment each had bases at Gorilovo in the 1950s. The military divisions were dissolved later on in the 1960s. Afterward, the airstrip was converted into an airplane repair site. By the 1990s, military helicopters were also stored there. The location was used to store trucks and containers between 2006 and 2007. An aviation training facility that offers instructions in both single-engine and twin-engine aircraft has been using a portion of the airfield's west side for over a decade since 2010. Also, a jet called the IL-14P is being restored on the site by a couple of enthusiasts. Still, over time, many of the airfield structures have deteriorated. Nowadays, the majority of the structures are in rough shape and dangerous to enter. Although abandoned, the administrative buildings have stayed secured. Soviet Mi and Ka helicopter variants as well as other kinds, like MiG fighter planes, were among the helicopters stored there. Yet with rotting bodywork and broken glass, they're still all in a similar depressing state. Number 6. Pablo Escobar's plane. In the Exuma region of the Bahamas, on a serene island, there sits a corrosive reminder of the paradise's brief but dark past. As far away as you can get from any major city, Norman's Cay is extremely remote. Those who visit can find a sunken military transport plane from World War II that was once used to deliver Pablo Escobar's cocaine to the United States. Carlos Leder established and ran this base, expanding the little airfield on the island to accommodate his fleet and using it to transport shipments to the American market. At its peak, airplanes constantly used the airport to refuel as they traveled back and forth from Colombia to Florida. The Cay was heavily monitored by deadly attack dogs and scores of guards, armed from head to toe, to fend off possible threats to Leder's successful company. On November 15, 1980, a Curtiss C-46 Commando barely missed the runway on what was supposed to be another normal cocaine supply trip. The airplanes that were originally used in World War II eventually came to rest in the weak sandbanks around the Cay. After coming down on a tiny sandbank, the smuggling plane was abandoned entirely, but not before its cargo was retrieved. Thankfully, no lives were lost. The U.S. government eventually forced Leder's illegal operation out of the region, but the submerged aircraft remained unaffected, eventually providing a haven for marine life. As of now, the obscure location is periodically visited by brave divers who want to see for themselves a reminder of the island's infamous past. Number 5. Fighter planes. An unidentified area in the United States was featured in a YouTube video from 2017 where footage of at least 3 abandoned fighter jets was shown. The video depicts vintage airplanes from the 1970s and 1980s that have been disassembled and discarded in a forest. To avoid foreign intelligence access, the planes, which seem to be 2 F-14 Tomcats, were disposed of under strict supervision. An F-4 Phantom II can also be found nearby. In contrast to the F-4s, which had 2 General Electric J79 turbojet engines, the F-14s were equipped with enormous General Electric F-110 afterburning turbofan engines. The majority of the cockpit controls, the seats, and the equipment have been removed altogether, along with the electronics, especially any radars. They were placed away from everything else, and the wings have been removed. The voices of the people in the YouTube video suggest that the planes are somewhere in the southern US. Even if they don't specifically say where they are, you can tell from the accents. As seen by the trees that have grown out of some of the airplanes, the aircraft seem to have been there for a while. But why are Navy F-14s there in the first place? After being withdrawn from Navy duty in 2006, F-14s were chopped up and thrown away by the Department of Defense instead of donated to other nations as surplus defense equipment. The F-14 was sold to Iran before the Iranian Revolution in 1979, but the new unfriendly government in Tehran refused spares. Iranian spies have spent decades trying to get parts for their planes, and Iranian Tomcats are still being used to this day. The F-4 is a classic F-4N Phantom II from the U.S. Marine Corps. A YouTube viewer commented that the F-4's Navy Bureau number is 152267, which is the number given to new Navy and Marine Corps aircraft. These particular planes acted as gate guards at the Dallas Naval Air Station in Texas. It raised questions about how it ended up in pieces abandoned in the middle of nowhere when it was once on display at a U.S. military base. How do you think the planes got there? Let us know in the comments down below, and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Number 4. Michelangelo da Vinci. Villa Marzana is a neighborhood made up of only about 1,200 residents, and it's about an hour's drive from Venice. Gigi Stecca made headlines in 2000 by launching a restaurant here. His innovative but unsuccessful concept is still visible in a couple discarded aircraft today. He wanted to give ordinary people the chance to board an airplane. Stecca spent over 10 years working at retirement homes. While there, he learned that many of his residents had never been on a plane. They all loved watching them pass overhead while wishing they could board one someday. A Douglas DC-6 and a Tupolev Tu-134A, a control tower, and a helicopter were all part of the site where Stecca decided to build a restaurant. It was given the name Michelangelo da Vinci when it was decorated with copies of well-known works by Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. He served both pizza and beer. Stecca also created distinctive glasses used at the restaurant. The menu even included homemade desserts, bruschetta, salad, and nightly fish specials. Michelangelo da Vinci was officially closed in 2014 after continuous legal disputes with local authorities over zoning problems. Since then, no one has used the airplanes. Sculptures, frescoes, and a pool could all be found in the courtyard below the wings, where visitors once gathered together. On Sundays, there was live music throughout the summer, and Saturday nights were for disco. Nowadays, there is less formality at the crumbling site. A weather-beaten aircraft perched over a green pool with overgrown flora surrounding it awaits anyone who chooses to visit. But visitors claim it's still worth the trip thanks to the spectacular views. Number 3. Bali's abandoned planes. The most famous aircraft in Bali is a parked Boeing 737-200 that was abandoned near Pandawa Beach in the middle of a field. Many have tried to unravel the mystery of how and why the Boeing ended up here. The reason Bali has become a hub for abandoned planes is puzzling. How the airplane crashed into the limestone quarry and what is going to happen next is unknown. The plane was supposed to turn into a restaurant, according to rumors. Unfortunately, the funds were not sufficient, and the idea was shut down before it even started. Others have said that the business wanting to make it a restaurant wasn't able to get the proper licenses to do so, and that might be the reason why the project was cut. Visitors enter the site at their own risk, despite the no trespassing signs posted everywhere. Since the plane is in a quarry, it isn't possible to reach it in a safe manner. On the island, there are more abandoned aircraft other than the Boeing 737 off the Raya Nusa Dua Selatan Highway. On top of the rocks of Nyang Nyang Beach, another partial plane is perched. With an investment by Felix Denham in 2021, the plane was moved up to the peak of the cliffs. He expressed his hopes for the distinctive feature to become a local landmark and contribute to tourism in the region, according to reports. Another Boeing 737 is said to have crashed in South Kuta. Some locals will say that it was supposed to be turned into a home. Depending on who you ask, it was either going to be a movie theater or a museum. In any case, the aircraft is now a well-liked destination. Those who visit and get near the aircraft are required to pay an entrance fee. The last 2 airplanes abandoned in Bali are less well-known. One of them is the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, located near Kuta Beach and the Gate 88 Mall. The other one is a Boeing 737-200 that's in Bali's far western region. Many find it fascinating that despite Bali's tourism promotions of the island's scenic beauty, the excitement over abandoned sites continues to grow. Number 2. The Pegasus. In certain cases, when an airplane crashes and can't be restored due to its position, it's left as a historical monument. In Antarctica, a Lockheed C-121 Constellation that had been abandoned after a crash landing in 1970 is one example of this. The Pegasus had its last flight on October 8, 1970. The aircraft, which was a member of the U.S. Navy's VX-6 squadron, took off from Christchurch Airport in New Zealand and flew for 10.5 hours before reaching the Antarctic. There were 80 people on board the plane, including 12 crew members and 68 passengers. The 12-person crew included the commander, 2 co-pilots, 2 navigators, 2 flight engineers, a radio operator, and 2 loadmasters. As it approached McMurdo Station, the Lockheed C-121 Constellation met a powerful storm head-on. There was no visibility due to the snow, ice, and high winds. The Pegasus couldn't fly back to its starting point or a suitable airfield outside of the continent since there wasn't enough fuel. The plane eventually collided with the ice, leaving the runway barely visible. As all 4 engines were put into complete reverse, the right main gear was hot. The plane turned 210 degrees clockwise after hitting the snowdrift, moving backwards along the runway. As a result, the main landing gear was bent, sheared off inside the gear well right below its pivot. Over 50 years have passed since it first crashed here. It's a remarkable and amazing feat that all 80 people survived the crash without any serious injuries, considering the severe weather circumstances. Passengers stayed inside the airplane due to the severe weather and winds and the bitter cold. Despite the crash landing, the aircraft's fire danger was considered low. Since it was in a hard-to-see location, recovery took some time. Visitors to McMurdo Station can still see the crash site today, where the plane is partially buried in ice and snow. Pegasus Field was given a new name for the accident and the ice runway in honor of the plane. The extra summer melt forced the field to close in 2014, though, so it's no longer used as a blue ice runway. And at number 1, Lockheed Jetstar. A 1962 Lockheed 1329 Jetstar owned by Elvis Presley has been auctioned off. On December 22, 1976, Elvis Presley paid $840,000 for it. But for the past 35 years, the plane has simply been abandoned on an airfield near Roswell, New Mexico. Elvis had 3 planes. The 8-seat Lockheed Jetstar was just one of them. But he only had it for a year before he died on August 16, 1977. The cabin of the airplane is still intact despite the fact that it has been inactive in the desert for some time. Its vivid red velvet chairs, gold-finished hardware, marble bathroom sink, and wood cabin paneling might still be appealing to an interested buyer. A microwave, tape player, and a portable television made by Kenmore will also be up for grabs along with the aircraft's cargo. The plane needs a trailer and was offered as is. It has no engines and most of the cockpit's equipment has been taken out entirely. The aircraft, which was released in the late 1950s and manufactured into the 1970s, was one of 204 built by the Lockheed Corporation. The Jetstar was the only aircraft of its type ever made by the firm, and it was initially a private project targeted towards the United States Air Force. Its design was intended for the business jet market, but was later scrapped as a prototype for the USAF. The aircraft can usually be identified by its 4 fixed engines on the back of the fuselage. Elvis once had 2 of these planes, the second of which, named Hound Dog 2, is currently stored at Graceland. Rich people and celebrities were big fans of the plane. It was originally owned by Frank Sinatra and U.S. President Richard Nixon.
8. Horse Sand Fort. Off the coast of Portsmouth, England, in Solent Strait, a strange circular armor-plated structure measuring 200 feet, 61 meters in diameter, is visible from the shore. But it seems a world away as it rusts among the waves. Known as the Horse Sand Fort, it's one of 4 structures called the Palmerston Forts that were built between 1865 and 1880 in response to the threat of a seaborne invasion from France. Today, the Horse Sand Fort is visibly decaying due to the point of almost being an eyesore. It looked much better during the late 19th century, though, when its exterior was painted with a black and white checkered pattern. Designs like this, known as razzle-dazzle camouflage, were meant to confuse enemies when it came to calculating a structure's dimensions, position, and/or distance. The structure consists of 2 floors and a basement that housed 100 chambers, including living quarters. During World War I, the fort operated as a naval signaling station, but it saw limited action due to the heavy buildup of British military defenses in the area at the time. It was also used during World War II and sustained significant damage during airstrikes. The Palmerston Forts were promptly taken out of service when the conflict ended. Horse Sand Fort has been vacant ever since. In fact, the only reason it hasn't been demolished is because it would cost more than just letting it sit there. It reportedly sold to an unnamed buyer in 2021, but it's unclear what the new owner plans to do with it. 7. Ross Island. In 1857, civilians rebelled against British colonial rule in India. The uprising was still going on the following year when the country's jails became overcrowded with rebels, prompting colonial authorities to begin scouting for a place to build a penal colony to house prisoners that were arrested in the revolt. They ultimately settled on a handful of small islands in the remote Andaman and Nicobar Islands, located 800 miles, 1,287.5 kilometers from the Indian mainland. It ensured that there was nowhere for prisoners to escape, and that the inmates couldn't receive any help from members of the movement on the outside. The prisoners' administration was headquartered on a tiny landmass measuring less than 1/3 of a square mile, 0.85 square kilometers, known as Ross Island. Inmates spent years being forced to clear trees and build dozens of Victorian-style buildings, including a church and an extravagant bungalow for the penitentiary's commissioner. The island also had tennis courts, a swimming pool, a ballroom, and lavish gardens to ensure that the highest-ranking staff members and their families were comfortable living in a place that most officials considered a punishment to be assigned to. In contrast, thousands of prisoners lived in deplorable conditions. They were malnourished, overworked, and exposed to diseases like malaria, dysentery, and cholera. They were even forcefully experimented on with malaria drugs that often made them extremely sick and depressed. Their living quarters were horrible, and most of them had leaking roofs. Enforcing discipline only became more difficult for the British as India's movement for freedom grew throughout the early 20th century. A massive 3-story jail was built at nearby Port Blair, and in 1937, the Ross Island Penal Colony closed its doors. India's fight for independence continued for another 10 years before the colonial government was officially disbanded. Today, the buildings at Ross Island are derelict and overgrown, standing as an eerie reminder of the abundant luxury colonial leaders lived in, while committing horrific atrocities against freedom fighters and political prisoners. 6. Ukivok. In the northern Bering Sea, roughly 40 miles, 64 kilometers west of Cape Douglas in Alaska, there's a small landmass with steep rocky cliffs on all sides. Known as King Island, it doesn't look like the type of place anyone would want to live, let alone royalty. But it was once the home of a settlement called Ukivok, where around 400 members of the Inupiat group of indigenous Alaskans spent their winters. Their history on the island impressively dates back over 1,000 years. This group, who called themselves the Asuluk or Ugjuvanmut, survived mainly by whaling and fishing during the summer. Then, when the thick winter ice formed, they traveled to Ukivok and hunted crabs, seals, and walruses, while living in huts that were propped up on stilts along the sloped shoreline. During the mid-20th century, the Bureau of Indian Affairs closed the village's school, reportedly due to the risk of rock slides. Children were then required to stay on the mainland year-round. Without having them on the island to help gather food, Ukivok's residents were left with no choice but to migrate to the Alaskan mainland and make a living there. By 1970, all the residents of King Island had relocated, leaving the entire landmass abandoned. A half-century later, their stilt village still stands, as if it's somehow waiting for them to return, although it's in a visible state of decay. The building that once functioned as its church was dismantled during the 1980s due to the risk of collapse, and some of the remaining structures look like they may be headed toward a similar fate. King Islanders have maintained a distinct cultural identity since moving to the mainland, but occasionally, some of them return to the island to gather food. Other than that, it's remained largely uninhabited. 5. San Giorgio in Alga. Humans began building on the small Italian island of San Giorgio in Alga, or as it's known in English, St. George in the Seaweed, as early as 1000 AD. Located in the Venetian lagoon, it was first home to a Benedictine monastery. Several other monasteries soon popped up, but by the early 15th century, the island was mostly abandoned. In 1404 AD, the monasteries became home to a small community of Augustinian monks who headed a congregation called the Canons Regular of San Giorgio in Alga. Over the next 2 centuries, the group played an essential role in reforming monastic life in northern Italy. But unfortunately, religious life on the island came to an end in 1717, when a catastrophic fire destroyed most of its buildings. During the 18th century, when Venice fell under Austrian rule, a political prison was established on the island. It mostly housed Venetian prisoners who were unhappy with the fact that they were now under Austrian leadership. By World War I, San Giorgio in Alga was back under Italian control, and the Italian military built bunkers on the island. But oddly enough, they were never used. During World War II, the Italians and Germans used the island as a secret training base for free-diving frogmen, who were trained to attach bombs to enemy ships and lay mines. To avoid detection, they only practiced at night under the cover of darkness. The island was once again abandoned after the war and has remained in a state of disuse ever since. Several of its buildings are in ruins from being bombed during World War II, while others are in a state of natural decay as they succumb to the effects of time and neglect. Included among the crumbling remains is a 15th century church that was renovated after the 1717 fire. Most of the military and religious artifacts that were left behind have been removed by visitors, leaving only the dilapidated structures behind. Have you ever considered joining a monastery or know anyone who has? Let us know in the comments below, but first be sure to hit that subscribe button. 4. Goli Otok. 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, off the Croatian coast in the Adriatic Sea. There's a barren, desolate island that was once home to a top-secret Yugoslavian political prison that was described by its inmates as a living hell. Known as Goli Otok, the island was an ideal location for isolating the prison population and avoiding the prying eyes of the public. Nicknamed the Croatian Alcatraz, Goli Otok operated as a prison and labor camp from 1949 to 1989. Only men were housed there, but female prisoners experienced similarly dismal conditions at a prison on the nearby island of Sveti Grugor. Goli Otok functioned specifically as a political prison up until 1956. It was more or less a dumping ground for accused Stalinists, Soviet sympathizers, and anyone who spoke out against Yugoslavian dictator Josip Broz Tito. Inmates were worked nearly to death as they were forced to quarry tunnels and build the very fortifications that they languished in. They were also put through a so-called re-education regimen that involved severe punishment against any staff members suspected of being an enemy of Tito's regime. The horrors of Goli Otok spread to the mainland, where the civilians grew to live in constant fear of being taken away by the Yugoslavian secret police for saying or doing even the tiniest thing wrong. Prisoners who made it back to the mainland from Goli Otok were terrified but silent, because they'd already lived to experience the horror of Croatian Alcatraz, and they hoped to never go through it again. 3. Okunoshima. Located 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, off the coastal city of Takehara in Japan's Seto Inland Sea, Okunoshima, better known as Usagi-jima or Rabbit Island, is famous for its population of friendly wild rabbits who approach humans without hesitation. But it has a dark history, starting with a chemical munitions plant that was built on the island in 1927. Operated by the Imperial Japanese Army Institute of Science and Technology, it was used in a secret program to develop chemical weapons. Japanese authorities went out of their way to keep the plant's existence a secret, even though it wasn't in violation of the Geneva Protocol, which banned chemical warfare, but not the production of chemical weapons. They chose Okunoshima for its isolation, which allowed them to carry out their experiments far away from prying eyes. The island was also removed from maps to avoid having anyone find out about it. Throughout its operation, the plant produced thousands of tons of mustard gas, phosphine, and other toxic chemicals. They were tested on rabbits, which may explain the presence of the abundant modern-day population that attracts thousands of visitors every year. The plant is believed to have been the only facility of its kind in Japan, which means that it made all of the gas that was used against Chinese soldiers and civilians throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Allied soldiers discovered the site after the war ended and subsequently dumped a large amount of the poison gas into the sea. The ruins of the old factory still stand today, and the island is home to a museum dedicated to educating people about the role the plant's activities played in the war. 2. Palmyra Atoll. Halfway between American Samoa and the Hawaiian Islands in the Central Pacific, there's a remote chain of atolls and coral islands called the Northern Line Islands. One of them, known as the Palmyra Atoll, is named after a ship that wrecked on its surrounding reef in 1802. The ship's crew observed no signs of previous human habitation, and it's unclear whether any settlements ever existed there. From 1862 to 1898, Palmyra was part of the Hawaiian Kingdom. It only became an American territory when the U.S. annexed Hawaii. And in 1922, a wealthy family leased the island and harvested its coconuts in order to manufacture coconut oil. The U.S. Navy established a presence on the atoll in 1939, marking the beginning of the only period where permanent residents lived on Palmyra. 2 years later, the Palmyra Island Naval Air Station opened its doors. The Navy made extensive changes to the landscape by blasting a ship canal, building roads to connect islands, and paving a runway. They even built new islands and expanded existing islands with dredged coral. Before leaving Palmyra in 1947, the military demolished some buildings while leaving others intact. Since the war, most of the visitors to the island have been scientific researchers. It remained under private ownership until the year 2000, when the Nature Conservancy bought most of the territory for coral reef conservation research. There's still a handful of cabins to accommodate visiting scientists, but they typically only stay for a month or so. 1. Mamula. Once called Rodina, the island known today as Mamula in the Adriatic Sea sits at the entrance to the Bay of Kotor off Montenegro. It got its present name after Austro-Hungarian general Lazarus von Mamula built a large fort on the island in 1853. Occupying roughly 90% of Mamula's surface area, the fort was part of the Austro-Hungarian army's plans to prevent enemies from entering the Bay of Kotor. During World War II, the island fell under the control of the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, who turned the fort into a concentration camp. It mostly housed prisoners from the surrounding area and was known, like most other concentration camps, for torturing and committing other atrocities against its captives. Records are scarce, but at least 130 deaths have been associated with the concentration camp at Mamula, most of which resulted from starvation. The fort was abandoned after the war, but it still stands today, along with the ruins of some of the prison cells where thousands of captives were held in. In 2016, the Montenegrin government approved plans to turn Mamula's fort into a luxury hotel and resort. The decision went against the wishes of former prisoners, but those who supported the idea pitched it as a great way to create jobs for the country's growing tourism industry. According to the most recent updates, the Switzerland-based Orascom Development Holding AG has signed a 49-year lease and will fund the controversial project. The company reportedly agreed to build a memorial to the concentration camp victims, but the idea of turning the site into a fun place still doesn't sit well with many. Former prisoners and others who seek to commemorate the island's past would rather see the entire site preserved, both as a memorial and for educational purposes. Which of these islands would you most like to visit? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.